Hello and welcome everyone to Librari Con 2020. It does look a little bit different, doesn't it? My name is Mary Kleemeyer, and with me today is
Vic Smith.
And today we're going to talk about the very basics of D&D. And of course that stands for Dungeons and Dragons, a game created in 1974, and it is more popular today than it's ever been. Tomorrow, of course, we will have an actual play video for you. But today, in case you know nothing about it or just want a refresher, we're going to talk a little bit about the very basics. So to get started, who plays D&D? People from all walks of life play D&D. Typically, we'll have a game runner or a GM, also known as a DM, and typically 3 to 4 other players, although you can have as few as 2 players and as many as 10, sometimes more. What is D&D? Well, that's a big question, but generally it's agreed upon that D&D is collective storytelling with a random element of dice. When do people play D&D? Generally, people play D&D on a bi-weekly or weekly basis with the same group. Although sometimes people play as often as every few days, or as little as every few months together. Where do people play D&D? Well, no, that's a good question. Typically, people play D&D together in people's homes, gaming stores, and online on various platforms, be it through Skype, Zoom, Discord, or other online services. Why do people play D&D? Well, because it's fun. D&D is a fun game. You spend time with friends, you tell stories, and you can explore choices and risks and aspects of yourself in a consequence-free environment. So that's the who, what, when, where, and why of D&D. But what are some of the very basic terms of D&D?
There are some terms and stats that you need to know in order to start playing D&D. Of course, the first one is, what is D&D? Mary discussed it a little bit. She said Dungeons and Dragons, and that is actually the name of the game that you're playing. So there are other games out there that are role-playing games, but in this case, we're specifically talking about the Dungeons and Dragons game that is now on version 5. So there have been other versions of it in the past, and the most recent one is number 5. Also, the term roleplay, which is basically just you acting as a character that is different from yourself. So you're role-playing whoever you've created to play in this D&D game. And then, of course, the DM or the GM is the abbreviation of the Dungeon Master or the Game Master. So that person is the person who runs the game, who is going to create the world or run the game that you're playing, and they kind of lead the way in the story that you're playing. They show you where you're going, they give you options what you're going to play, so they present the scenario to you, and then you can interact with them in that world. So you, as the player interacting with DM, are the player character. So you are the PC, or the player character, who has created your character, and you keep track of that character's abilities, your hit points, all of the things that you can do in this world, and then you use those to interact with the world. Now, the next term is DC, or difficulty class, and that is how difficult it is to do whatever you're trying to do. So how difficult it is to attack, how difficult it is to get saved from whatever you're doing, how difficult it is to like jump over a rock or a ledge that you're trying to get over. So anything that you do has a difficulty level, and that is what you do a difficulty class for. And then when you're rolling that, roll a crit. That is either a natural 20 on the D20 or a natural 1. And that means that you've either done so well that you can basically perfectly pass, like in combat, you can definitely hit if you roll a natural 20, or you've rolled a natural 1 and you've done so badly that you're very likely to just fail. So you definitely miss that attack when you're attacking, or you're very unlikely to do past whatever ability check that you're doing or whatever saving throw that you're doing. Now, in order to pass or to do the attacks and things, you have hit points. So your hit points are your health, basically. So when you're in an encounter and you're attacking, you are removing hit points from the other characters. Now, when they attack you, they can remove your hit points, and if your health gets down to 0, then you go unconscious. So having 0 HP is the start of maybe going unconscious or dying. So all of those are very important terms for D&D, and next we're going to talk about races and what kind of people you can play in this game.
Yes. In the world of Dungeons & Dragons, especially as more and more books come out for 5th edition, your choices of races keep expanding. We're not going to talk about every single one because that would frankly be its own video. But we are going to talk about 10 of some of the normal traditional D&D races. First, of course, you have humans. Humans are pretty self-explanatory. They're your generalists. They can be good at lots of different things. They're all over the place. And generally, they're just your normal standard person. And then, of course, there's your elf. And they are long-lived and graceful humanoids who have pointed ears. There are several subraces of those, such as high elves, wood elves, and drow or dark elves. There's also half elves, who are the children of humans and elves. Basically, just like with a certain Tolkien fantasy, there was a romance between a human and an elf, and the children are known as half-elves. There's also Dragonborn, which are the humanoid descendants of the dragon gods. They have 2 legs and arms and everything just like every other race, but they are very dragony, to be succinct, and they can also breathe fire, which is pretty cool. You also have your dwarves. They're stout and hardy humanoids, and usually bearded. There's several different kinds of dwarves, including hill dwarves, mountain dwarves, and dwergar, who typically live under the mountains. And then, of course, we have gnomes, who are small humanoids with an affinity for magic and illusion. There are a couple different kinds, including forest gnomes, rock or tinker gnomes, and sverneblin. Yes, sverneblin. And those are the gnomes who live under the mountains with the dwergar and drow. Of course, there are half-orcs, who are the children of orcs and humans. They're usually large and strong. Of course, we have halflings, who are humanoids of about half normal size, half human size. They're typically very jovial and they love to eat. There are 2 different kinds, Lightfoot and Stout halflings. And then there are tieflings, who are humanoids with a fiendish lineage. They typically have horns and a tail and have some innate magic. And then there are goblins, who are small humanoids with large ears and natural stealthiness. There are lots and lots of other races, including people who look like elephants, people who look like hippos, people who look like birds. There's a whole host of different kinds of people you can be in the world of D&D. Pretty much, if you can imagine it, you can be it. And that's just races. There's also a whole bunch of different classes you can play as in the world of Dungeons and Dragons.
Now, there are 12 main classes in Dungeons & Dragons. Of course, there are others that have been added at later times, but these are the ones that you start with that are in the main player's handbook. So they're in alphabetical order in the player's handbook, and they are here as well. So the first one is Barbarian. They are fierce warriors, and they usually come from a primal background, so they're likely to come from like a clan or something that is outside society, and then they either go into it or wander the wilds and fight things, basically. And then there is the Bard, which is, of course, the music player, the one who gives inspiration to others. They could sing, they could play instruments, they have proficiency in a couple different kinds of ways to make music, and they are creating power with their music, which is pretty cool. And then there is the cleric, which is kind of a mix of fighting and healing class. They are a champion of a god who wields magic power and who can also fight pretty well. So they are usually in service of something higher, and they're traveling. They're usually the healer of the party. Then there is the druid, of course, which is a nature-based magic user who is a mage who can usually transform into animals. There are some that can transform a little better into animals, and there are some that are more magic-based. And they are usually, magic players who are nature-based. And then there's just the basic fighter, which is you fight things and you have a weapon that you use. And there are a couple different ones that are a little more advanced that have like arcane abilities, but at its base, you're just swinging your sword at something. And then the next one is a monk, which is like a martial artist. So they might have a weapon, but it's going to be something simpler. They're really fighting with their body, and they have like key points that they can use, and that's how they get the more advanced abilities that they have. And that is also a physical fighter. And then there is the paladin, which is a warrior for a god. And so they have oaths that they have to fulfill and that they have to follow, and that dictates the path that they're on. But they are much more martial than the clerics. So while clerics are going to heal a little more, paladins are going to more likely be on the front lines or fighting a little more. And then the next class is the ranger. So the ranger is a warrior class who is like on the edges of civilization. So they're more likely to be scouts, and they're more likely to be going through nature and leading people on like quests or something. And they are slightly magical, so they have some spells that they can use, but they are also, you can build a ranger who is on the front lines, who is mainly a fighter as well. So they're a very versatile class. And then there is rogue, of course, who is stealth and trickery and behind the scenes, and is using their wiles kind of to defeat the enemies. So they're much more likely to be sneaky. They're more likely to have kind of a sketchy background. And so they're definitely, you can get on the front lines with them, but you're much more likely to be kind of moving around the other players and arranging things behind the scenes. And so next is the sorcerer, which is a spellcaster. So it's very similar to the other spellcasters that we have, but they get their magic from their blood or from a gift that they've gotten. So it's not that they have external magic that they're using, it's coming from internal sources. And so the warlock, on the other hand, which is the next class, has made a bargain with someone. So something external has given them the ability to do these powers, and because they've made a pact with them, or they've made an agreement, or they're doing something for that power, they now can do magic. And unlike those two, the last class, wizard, just learns magic. So they study very hard and they learn about magic and what magic is, and because they've put in that work, they can now do magic. And that is the most basic magic level class that we have. So the wizard is going to have the most spells, it's going to be most dependent on spells compared to the warlock or the sorcerer or the cleric or even the bard, who has a lot of spells as well. So those are the main 12 classes that you can choose. You can see how between the races and between the classes, there are so many options that you can choose from. And once you have those set up and you know what you're going to play, you now have to figure out your stats and how you're going to use the statistics that you build your character with.
Yes. Statistics. Not like your math class, thank goodness, although there is math involved. We're not going to be doing any of that today. No, that will be tomorrow. And you can just watch us do math. It's amazing how difficult simple addition can be when you're fighting a monster. What are some of these statistics? What is some of the math? Basically, there is strength, which is, for example, the ability to crush a tomato. There is dexterity, which is your ability to dodge a tomato. There is constitution, the ability to eat a bad tomato. There is intelligence, knowing that a tomato is a fruit, also known as book smarts. There's wisdom, which is knowing not to put a tomato in a fruit salad, also known as street smarts. And finally, there's charisma, which is being able to sell a tomato based fruit salad, which isn't that just salsa? Um, with these stats, you create your character. There are a lot of different ways to get these stats. You can roll for them. You can use a certain standard array. There are a lot of different ways that you can use numbers to build your character. And you use these when you're doing certain actions. For example, in our upcoming game, there are going to be times when I ask our players to give me an ability check, which is basically just saying, hey, if you want to try to do this certain thing, you're going to have to give me an ability check that goes with a certain statistic. For example, haggling with the shopkeeper about the price of a magic item. That would require a persuasion check, which would use your charisma stat. There's also saving throws. So, for example, let's say I had my players in a room that had an infinite abyss, and they had to make a dexterity saving throw to keep from falling into that abyss. That would use their dexterity stat. These are just a few of the ways that statistics and numbers are used in the game. Another way that they're used is with the actual dice.
So there are a couple different dice that you're going to use if you play D&D. You can get them in sets that come with all of them, or you can buy them individually. And they go from a D4 all the way to a D20. And the number in that dice is the number of sides that it has. So a D4 is going to have 4 numbers on it, and a D20 is going to have 20 numbers on it, from 1 to whatever the highest number is. So your D6 is actually going to be the main dice that you're going to have encountered already, but we start with the D4, which is damage for small weapons. So if you have a dagger, you have a scythe, and you need to roll your damage, what you're going to do is likely use a D4. There are also some spells that use D4s as well, but it's definitely just the smallest amount of damage that you can do and the smallest amount that you can add to any rolls that you have. And then you have the D6, and if you remember talking about hit points earlier, which is your health, this is the first die that is used for some classes' hit points. So each level you roll your hit points with a die, and then you add your charisma modifier from the statistics, and that's how you know how much health you have. So the D6 is used for wizards and sorcerers who are more likely to be stepped back from the fight. And then it's also damage for something like a short bow, which is a smaller weapon, but a little more powerful than the weapons like daggers. And then you have a D8. So it is, of course, the 8-sided die. And it's a typical damage die for like medium weapons, so like long swords or scimitars. And it's also a lot of classes hit point die. So you have bards, clerics, druids, monks, rogues, and warlocks all use this for their hit die because it is that nice medium die. It's someone who's going to be in the action but also going to be stood back, which is a lot of classes because they're pretty versatile. So it makes it easier for those people to just have that medium kind of hit point level. And next is the D10, which if you have a very large weapon, so especially the two-handed one, it's more likely that you're going to have a D10 as the damage because that just increases it compared to those normal weapons like a longsword. And there are also the very fight-based characters are going to have this HP die. So it's the fighters, the paladins, the rangers who are going to be up in that action, who are going to be right in the face of the bad guys. They're the ones who are going to have this higher HP die. And then you have other uses for D10s as well, but that is kind of D100 territory, which is a little more advanced than this. So the next die is the D12, and that is very large weapons. So things like a great axe or a lance, which is going to be just the strongest people carrying them who can take the weight of the weapon and the strength of the weapon. that's where you get into D12 damage, because that's when you've reached very big hits, so you're really damaging that enemy. And then it of course is only the barbarian class hit die. So the barbarian, because they are the most martial, the biggest fighter class, they have the D12 unlike any other class. And then the most common die in D20 is the D20. It's the one that you use for attacks, the ones that you use for saves, the ones you use for ability checks. There are luck checks that you might use a D20 for. So when you're trying to do something in D&D, it's highly likely that you're going to have to roll a D20, or whoever you're trying to do it to will have to roll a D20, because those are the dice that really decide the what's going to happen in the game, decide where you're going and if you succeed or not. So when you're rolling those dice, there are some other things that will kind of affect what you're rolling and how you roll that. And those are the abilities and traits that you of your character that you get from things like races and classes and other things that are involved in D&D.
That's right. There are abilities and traits that a player character can get from their race, their class, their background, all kinds of things. They can be as powerful as having dark vision out to 60 feet, like a lot of races do. If you're a dwarf or, a goblin, some races have really good dark vision, like drow. They have dark vision out to 120 feet. So if you are running some kind of fight scenario or sneaky mission in the dark, those are the kinds of player characters who are going to be really proficient in that. There's also social skills that you could be proficient in. A lot of characters might be proficient with the persuasion skill, which means that if you're haggling with the shopkeep about the price of a magic item, hey, you know what? You might get a better price and keep some of your gold. You can also be proficient with items such as tinker's tools or musical instruments like a bagpipe. Now, you might think to yourself, how helpful is being proficient with the bagpipe if you're going to be fighting giant monsters? But ask yourself this: have you ever had a serious conversation with a bagpipe in the background? If your big bad evil guy is trying to plot and think about his evil plots and ways, and there's a bagpipe in the background, he's probably going to have a hard time thinking of those plans. And those are just some of the things that your characters can be proficient in. There are a few more steps, but these are the very basics of creating a character and playing D&D. That's all we have for today. Thank you for joining us. Check us out tomorrow when we have our actual play of Dungeons and Dragons, Adventures University. It will be myself as your game master or GM. And then we also have Vic and Katie and Margaret and Ross as my test subjects, or maybe just player characters. Which term do you prefer, Vic?
Definitely test subjects.
Yes.
I think you're definitely testing us for sure.
So thank you again for joining us. Check us out on our Facebook, Clermont County Public Library, and also our YouTube channel. That is where more Librari Con videos and activities will be popping up. So roll for initiative.